Thank you for inviting me. I planned to be with you today, but due to a family medical issue, I need to be here. And I'd like to wish you a very successful summit. I'd also like to thank Simon and Catherine in the University of Swansea for organising this summit. And finally, I'd like to congratulate the Welsh Government on consulting on their child poverty strategy. But one consequence of consultation, however, is that sometimes the very valuable responses from civil society mean that the strategy has to be redesigned. Now, this redesign is made easier because in June, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, the United Nations body that implements and oversees the Convention on the Rights of the Child, issued its comments on how child poverty can be reduced in the United Kingdom. I'm going to discuss this in relation to Wales's devolved powers on children's rights and in the relation to the binding nature on the Welsh Government of the best interests of the child, both of which are not sufficiently considered in the child rights strategy. There is an urgency towards preventing and overcoming child poverty, which is not always appreciated. We rightly have a Black Lives Matter. We rightly have a Me Too movement. But we lack the same urgency with child poverty. And this lack of urgency is replicated in this child poverty strategy. It's sometimes assumed that children's social and economic rights, rights to health, adequate housing, for example, are left to a government's discretion because they're thought to be only progressive and involve the expenditure of resources. But I want to explore with you ways that Wales can accept immediate binding duties on combating child poverty. It's true that Wales has not the devolved power to incorporate the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. It's also true that Scotland tried to incorporate the Children's Convention, and its attempt to do so was struck down by the Supreme Court, not on children's rights, but on devolution issues. But importantly, there are other ways to achieve the same goals for children. Now, firstly, there is the principle of the best interests of the child ought to be a primary consideration in all policies and actions. This is rarely applied to child poverty, but as a matter of binding law ought to be applied. The best interests of the child has a special status in international law. No country in the world has attached a reservation to it or objected to it. The name for this higher or overriding status, because every country in the world has accepted the principle, it's known in Latin as jus cogens. But it means that every government and local authority is under a binding legal duty to implement the best interests of the child as a primary consideration. And no government can opt out of it in relation to child poverty. This is what we intended when we were drafting the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. The Convention does not require a government to have treaty-making or incorporating powers to apply the best interests of the child to child poverty and to child poverty strategies. Best interests automatically has to be considered. And this includes considered in relation to child poverty. Indeed, in its most recent report on the United Kingdom as a whole, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child specifically highlighted the fact that the best interests of the child was not consistently applied across all areas of children's rights in the UK. And so the child poverty strategy needs to be fundamentally changed to incorporate this principle. Secondly, even though Wales is not able to incorporate the Children's Convention, Wales and the Welsh Government does have powers in relation to the Human Rights Act, and very often the Human Rights Act is not considered in relation to children and child poverty. But there are specific rights in the Human Rights Act which give combating child poverty a legally enforceable urgency for Wales and can be used to strengthen Wales's helpful due regard approach and also expand the Welsh public sector duty on socio-economic inequalities, which is also applicable to child poverty. The specific rights helpful in the Human Rights Act for combating poverty are the right to life and the right not to be denied an education. One could also argue that child poverty itself is degrading and therefore breaches the Human Rights Act, but the courts in the United Kingdom have never gone this far. The right to life in the Human Rights Act enshrines positive as well as negative duties. The space that the right to life gives could lead to the adoption of further policies to reduce the differences in life expectancies between those from poorer and wealthier families. Now, there's clear evidence that life expectancy in adults is shortened if adults, whilst their children suffer poorer diets, poorer health, and poorer housing. Therefore, it's also in the child's best interests that their right to life is not shortened because of the poverty that they suffer whilst they are still under the age of 18. The right to life and the public sector duty could also be applied to improving maternity and neonatal health facilities. A child's rights approach to combating poverty is essentially practically because it will lead to measurable concrete outcomes which identify where the duty lies and on whom and what body in enforcing a particular right. Now, the Welsh Government has already adopted the report Strengthening and Advancing Human Rights in Wales because it recognised a need for clarity about how to use objectives using human rights frameworks. Such a framework includes both the provisions of the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the Human Rights Act. So if the child poverty strategy starts and builds from a child rights approach, it opens up real practical opportunities for combating child poverty. The child poverty strategy also needs to analyse the recommendations of various United Nations bodies on child poverty. They are based on what works and what has worked around the globe. All these opportunities that I've mentioned flow from a child rights approach, but they don't follow on if we only consider children's well-being. A child's well-being is essential, but it loses its practical value if children's well-being is not woven into children's rights. Well-being is an aspect of fully implementing the Convention on the Rights of the Child. The child's right to education is an essential component of overcoming child poverty. The Human Rights Act provides that no one should be denied an education. Now, education in human rights law also has a qualitative aspect. This creates space for further policies on how working class children from a diverse range of backgrounds who were left behind in their education as a result of COVID can receive an equal quality of education to those of wealthier children. There's well-documented evidence from UNICEF going back decades that a hungry child or a child who has insufficient quality food lacks concentration and is at a significant disadvantage when trying to study. So to avoid discriminating in the right to education against working class children from a rich range of backgrounds, the child's right to an adequate standard of living is an aspect of the right to life and ought to be strengthened in the strategy. It's a very bitter irony that in Wales, as in the United Kingdom, a court can order the force feeding of someone, but courts cannot order the government to implement a right to food for everyone. Rather than getting dispirited, perhaps we ought to consider a different approach. We should argue that the right of the child not to be denied an education also includes having access to adequate nutrition. Reading the educational rights of the child together with the right to an adequate standard of living, which includes the right to food, provides very powerful tools for Wales to combat poverty. We tend to think of children's rights as involving the courts, but the majority of us drafting the convention were not only thinking of courts, but on how governments can use the provisions to measure their progress, which is essential in case further action needs to be taken. Sometimes when we want to combat child poverty, we become immobile because we're overwhelmed, and that's understandable. Where do we begin? But it's very helpful to divide combating child poverty into manageable steps. The first principle is that children's rights needs to be the structure within which child poverty is combated. Each of the rights in the Convention on the Rights of the Child needs to be analysed to see which parts are immediately binding on the Welsh Government because they enshrine a facet of an existing legal duty or right. Any rights which are not immediately binding also need to be included in a child's rights framework, because in relation to combating child poverty, they are essential for the Welsh public sector duty on socio-economic inequalities. A child's rights framework is also important because it empowers children. I had the pleasure of researching and writing with Angelina Jolie a book, Know Your Rights for Children. The book is full of the accounts of children born into poverty, using their rights to help other children as well as themselves. This is the constructive power of children's rights. And if children living in even greater poverty globally are able to transform their lives and the lives of others, so can children living in poverty in Wales. The second child rights principle, which is essential in combating child poverty, is the principle of accountability. Reading the draft child poverty strategy, it's rather unclear how either those children living in poverty or those who represent them can have a remedy. The draft report appears to lack a complaints mechanism. Any complaints mechanism which is adopted, however, would have to be designed together with children and their families whose experiences of poverty would ensure that such a complaints mechanism would be user-friendly for both children and their families. An important aspect of the principle of accountability is that targets must be set and indicators have to be devised to ensure that the global goal of overcoming child poverty is being met and can be scrutinised in an accessible and transparent way, and that includes in Wales. I mentioned that this summer, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child issued its concluding observations on the United Kingdom and how it is implementing the Children's Rights Convention. A Welsh child poverty strategy needs to incorporate these recommendations. Why would you ignore the body which the globe has entrusted with implementing child rights strategies? The UN Committee makes it clear that it's necessary for Wales to adopt clear outcome targets, measurable progress indicators, and robust monitoring and accountability mechanism. Although the UN Children's Rights Committee's recommendations are addressed to the government of the United Kingdom, many of its recommendations on child poverty could be implemented by the Government of Wales and ought to be included in the strategy. One essential recommendation is that all authorities should implement a child rights-based approach into the budgeting process. This means disaggregating how much is spent on children and anti-poverty measures, lifting children out of poverty, to ensure that the money is being spent effectively in the children's best interests. A number of local authorities around the world have adopted this process and have consulted with children over local budgets, and these children's recommendations have been included in the budget. Also, it's in the interests of the Welsh Government to promote and publicise the recommendations of the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child. This is because the government can argue that it's not party politics, but an international binding legal duty to apply the best interests of the child, which is separate from the power to incorporate the treaty. I am not saying that the draft children's poverty strategy ought to be rejected, because there's a lot in it that's positive, but that it ought to start from a different place. There is, for example, a welcome inclusion of intersectional inequality and non-discrimination. But this needs developing because a child poverty strategy ought to be more specific on how it would operate practically on policy formation and in decisions concerning the equality and non-discrimination of children living in poverty. So the Welsh Government ought to be congratulated on this first step, but no journey ends with the first step. Diolch.